Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of your group work, in which we're going to introduce a case study. And so the goal of a lot of this group work is going to be for you to be actively thinking about real case studies, real problems with wildlife management, with wildlife populations, and how managers can potentially deal with them. In some cases, these are things that have been dealt with already in the past, but in others, it's an ongoing situation. So for today, since we talked about last week about not about urban, about limited resources, okay? So food as a limited resource and cover to some extent is too. I want to talk about a very common situation, unfortunately, that involves where food becomes such a limited resource that you can get large scale starvation of populations. And this relates to overpopulation, specifically. Often we're thinking about ungulate populations, okay, deer, elk, things like that, okay? And these things tend to play out in a very specific pattern, right? An ungulate population gets too large. It may be because it's protected from hunting and most of its natural predators, like let's say wolves or something like that, have been removed from the population. And so there's no predation check on it. And so the population grows very fast and gets very large. Okay. So in this week's modules, you'll be learning about carrying capacity. If you've taken ecology before, you might remember that. The idea here is that carrying capacity is the number of animals that can sustainably be maintained in an environment. And when you're talking about overpopulation, you're very much well above carrying capacity. Okay. So what happens is that these animals, of which there are so many, way too many for what the resources are available in the environment, they begin to overbrowse or overgraze the vegetation. Okay, so they eat it down to basically nothing. Okay, and this reduces new vegetation growth. Okay, because they're eating even for grass, and we'll talk when we later in the semester when we get to range management that the point of growth in grass is very close to the ground, and so normally grazing is good because they don't eat that little bit near the ground. But when things are overgrazed, they even eat that little bit of growth, right? And so because you've eaten the growth tissue of the plants, this reduces new vegetation growth, right? So it means actually that then there's less food available than there would have been if that ungulate population had not overbrowsed or overgrazed. Okay, so this reduction, this eating of everything down to nothing, and then reduced regrowth means that there's a major crash in food availability. And when you have so many animals, that crash in food availability means a crash in population size, and usually that means that what happens, the mechanism by which that happens, is large scale starvation, right? And so, as managers, we often try to think about that. This is, you can think, well, it's nice to, think about deer as protected, and we don't want to like hurt them, but like starving to death is a horrible way to go, right? So let's say harvesting animals via gun or bow or something, that's a more humane way to go than to starve to death, right? So this is why managers often have to intervene to keep things like this from happening. And so just to give you an example, these are deer on the Kaibab Plateau in Arizona. Between 1907 and 1937, there were more than 800 mountain lions removed from this area, and wolves had been exterminated in that same time. Okay, basically, all the predators had been removed or greatly reduced. Okay, even like coyotes and bobcats had been heavily culled, right? So there's no predators and there was no hunting allowed. And so you went from around 400 animals in 1905 to 100,000 in 1924. Okay, so this is, so they can't even like put it on the scale because it's be too high, right? So the population grew exponentially. It grew very, very, very fast, right? Well, then just what we said, the vegetation couldn't keep pace. It was overgrazed, overbrowsed. This led to reduced vegetative growth, and 60% of the herd starved over 2 winters, which you can see is what happens here where you have a massive drop. Okay. And here, this is showing that this is the carrying capacity, which again, you'll learn about more this week in the modules, that actually this vegetative damage that was caused by overgrazing and overbrowsing led to a reduced carrying capacity for that environment. Okay. So this is what, as managers, you'd want to avoid happening. Um, you know, 60,000 dead deer in 2 years. That's pretty bad, and have starved to death. So this brings us to thinking about deer in an urban environment, okay? And that the problem with this is that often in urban environments, there are no natural predators. Those have long been extirpated from the area. And there's often no hunting allowed, right? Because of the close quarters with humans, right? And so we can quickly get into situations in urban areas where if the deer can find some vegetative resources that are stable, their populations can grow very quickly. And so the case study you're going to be talking about today is Staten Island. Okay. On Staten Island, which is a borough of New York City, you can see it here in orange. The first deer were really started to be seen on the island in the early 90s. Okay. Before that, there were no deer on the island. Okay. Presumably, these migrated from upstate New York. Whatever, they showed up in the island in the early 90s. By 2000, they really established some populations that it was a regular occurrence to see deer. Okay. And so, and just to give you an idea of how the numbers changed, right? In a 2008 survey, they found that there were 24 white-tailed deer on Staten Island. Now, remember, Staten Island's a grossly populated area, and it's not that big. So 24 deer could actually make for a fairly regular occurrence that you see one if you live there, right? But this population was clearly growing in an unchecked manner because just 6 years, another survey found that there were 793 white-tailed deer. Okay, so that's an over 3,000% increase in that 6 year period. So clearly there's a problem here with the deer population. And beyond simply trying to think about, well, we don't want this population to starve and there to be dead deer everywhere, there's a variety of other problems that come with um, with ungulate populations being very high in human dense areas. Okay, first is that there are collisions, right? I suspect that a lot of you either have yourself or know someone who has hit a deer with their car, which is a pretty horrible experience. Okay. Nationwide, this is data from 2000, there's roughly 1.5 million animal vehicle collisions a year, and this leads to about 200 human deaths and over $1 billion in property damage. Okay, so that's not a trivial amount of damage, right? On Staten Island, not surprisingly, especially between 2008 and 2014, they saw a rapid increase in the number of collisions, right? Again, Staten Island's a densely populated area. It's a borough of New York City. There's now over 700 deer by the summer of 2014 in this area. And so it's not surprising that they saw a big uptick in the number of deer vehicle collisions. And just to show, in summer of 2014, in one area where there was a lot of deer activity, they had 3 collisions at one location. Right, so clearly, it's not just being worried about starving deer. There's conflict with the human population, and that there's people dying or having tons of property damage or bodily damage because of collisions with these deer. Other factors that come into play when you have an urban deer population is to think about disease. Okay, so Lyme disease in New York, they have the types of ticks that can spread Lyme disease, and that white-tailed deer are the primary host for these ticks, right? So what that means is that you could have the ticks be previously, before the deer really established, could be very low numbers because they don't have a lot of hosts, because there's not a lot of large mammals other than humans on Staten Island, and humans are good at picking ticks off, right? But now all of a sudden you have an explosion in this deer population, and and all of a sudden there's a breeding ground, literally a breeding ground of deer for all these ticks to grow on, right? And so this is a data talking in Connecticut, where they were also having problems with white-tailed deer density. The number of resident reported cases of Lyme disease per 100 households was strongly correlated to deer density in the community. Reducing deer density, by 5.1 deer per square kilometer resulted in a 76% reduction in tick abundance and comparable reductions in the risk of getting Lyme disease. Okay, so having a huge deer population in your backyard increases the chance that you will get bit by ticks and that they will give you Lyme disease. Okay, the next two components we'll talk about really have to do with, well, they're both vegetative damage, right? One thing deer really like to do is get into people's gardens. You may know that yourself if we have deer in Fargo and they in Moorhead, and they definitely will get into people's gardens if they can, and they'll eat both, fruit and vegetable gardens as well as just ornamental plants and flowers, right? And it might seem like, well, who cares, right? Well, the landowners who get all their flowers that they've poured hours of time and energy into growing, when they're gone in a couple hours because the deer come through, they complain, right? And they're a loud voice sometimes in the community. So even though you might think, oh, who cares about this, the people who have their stuff eaten, they care, and they loudly talk about it, right? Thinking more broadly about some areas, more natural areas, right? And this is part of why Staten Island can support this deer population, is they do have a large natural area that runs through kind of a good chunk of Staten Island called the Green Belt. Okay, and the Greenbelt has natural forests, and there's groups that have worked very hard to remove invasive species from the Greenbelt and keep it healthy, right? To restore it to like just a fragment, but still a fragment, something of a natural forest, right? So that people can enjoy a natural area. And so the presence of this Greenbelt space has given the deer some resources, right? But the problem is, again, as the population has grown, you expect overgrazing and overbrowsing to lead to long-term damage to that green belt area, okay, that natural area in Staten Island. And that's bad for the health of that ecosystem, and also if the primary purpose of that space is to give people a chance to enjoy nature, then it degrades that as well, right? So that's the background on the Staten Island case, okay? And so now you're going to start to think about who might be some stakeholders who are impacted by this particular problem.